Hello, and welcome to Tales from the Trunk, reading the stories that did make it. I'm Hilary B. Bisnetz. Listeners, I'm beyond excited today to welcome probably one of my oldest, online writing friends. You may know him as a Hugo-winning fan writer for A Dribble of Ink. Aidan Moher, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It
Absolutely.
has been a while, hasn't it?
It's been a grip. It's really been a minute.
It's been a good minute.
It's been a good minute, but
Yeah.
you've been killing it since then, quietly building. And if listeners, if you don't already follow Aidan on Twitter, you have your priorities out of whack. If you do follow Aidan on Twitter, you already have probably seen that we're going to be talking today about fight magic items, the history of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and the rise of Japanese RPGs in the West, which I'm just so pumped about this book.
Thanks. I am too. I'm still not really sure how I convinced anybody along the path of many people I had to convince to actually let me not just write the book but publish it through one of the big 5 or big 4, big 2 publishers, however many are left.
We're recording this in September. By October, who even knows?
Who knows? Everybody's owned by Amazon at that point.
Yeah. Unfortunate.
But yes, it's it's a book that I've, had inside me forever.
Mm-hmm.
Since I was that little kid, right? And I was reading gaming magazines, where I first learned about all the Japanese RPGs and those obsessions started. And, I've collected experiences, and this is about kind of giving those back to the fandom of not just Japanese RPGs and Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, but gamers and people who still love Japanese RPGs and video games, or people who played them as a kid and then fell out, and as an adult they're like, oh yeah, I remember those games, I loved those, and they want to just revisit those memories as well. And I have a great agent, great editor, great publisher, great publishing team, and they all said, yeah, write that book and we'll get it out to readers for you. And I did, and I have, and it's pretty fun.
I was so stoked as soon as I saw your announcement, and then I immediately was like, hey, that's coming out. I don't have a podcast guest for that month. I'm gonna call Aidan right away and be like, hey, book tour, my place.
Yeah, I was really excited to hear from you because I've enjoyed your podcast since you launched it. And we tried to connect at the beginning, and it didn't work out. And I've always kind of regretted that, and I've always wanted that opportunity to join your guests because I really love what you do here.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, I was also like, we had been in talks in the first season, and then it just never really panned out for a variety of life reasons that absolutely happen. But here we are now, and here we get to celebrate our love of all things pixels and polygons.
Absolutely.
So you're going to be reading out of the preface of this book. Is there anything we need to know other than what we've just said going into this?
I don't think so. The prelude breaks down what the book is about, why I'm writing it, why I think it's an important story to tell. I think the title of the book is pretty self-explanatory. It's Fight Magic Items is the history of Japanese RPGs, with a specific focus on how they sort of found and rose to popularity in the West, and then diminished a little, and have sort of more recently been kind of finding a comeuppance through indie developers and younger game creators who are our age, and they grew up playing the original Final Fantasy games, and now they're the ones making the new RPGs. And how does that inform not just Japanese RPGs, but video games as a whole that have adopted stuff that Japanese RPGs sort of created back in the day. And so it's this
Yeah.
kind of holistic look at the rise and legacy of Japanese RPGs in the West through the lens of like Western fandom.
Fantastic.
But the prelude explains all of that. So I think I really wanted to put a lot of myself and my experiences into the book. And one thing that I've seen from like early reviews and early feedback from readers is like, I've had people say the book made them nostalgic for games they didn't even play or experiences they weren't old enough to have, or they were really into fighters and their friends were really into like fighters and beat 'em ups at the time, and this felt like going back and having like an alternate version, an alternate history of their own life where their friends were into RPGs.
Oh yeah.
Which was really gratifying to me. And, someone else described it as, just geeking out with a best friend about games that you love together. And that's the thing that I really wanted to put into this book, is that like, I didn't want it to feel like, just a bunch of Wikipedia articles, right?
Yeah.
I think the reason everybody, and certainly myself, is drawn to video games in general is just the emotions it evokes, right? The experiences we have that we keep and bring with us through life and then share with others. And so I wanted to do that with this book, and this prelude really kind of like sets that stage. It's like, here's the journey that I went on that I bet you went on as well. Maybe not with these games, maybe not even with Japanese RPGs, but with something in your life. And I want to share that feeling with you and make people walk away feeling, nostalgic and and informed and like engaged and invigorated about the idea of like the merging of story and interactive storytelling and like video game pieces.
Yeah. And I mean, that's really what I want, not necessarily specifically the video game part, but that's what I want out of any nonfiction book, is like to feel connected.
Yeah, exactly. And so, this story, the prelude focuses mostly on my experiences, but a big part of the book, every chapter is like pulling forward the people that surround the games. And so that's, myself and other fans. That's, critics and reviewers like looking at the games at the time. Like I reference a lot of archival material, but also the creators themselves, and trying as much as I can to pull the creators and their experiences and their, their dreams and like, what went right, what went wrong, how they evolved and how games changed them. Like all of that I wanted to put into these chapters, like explore the games through the people who enjoyed and created them.
For sure.
And I hope people enjoy that. I think it makes it, for a fun read, an engaging read, and it leaves people feeling like, even if they knew all the, the technical history of a game, they leave maybe understanding the game a little better because they understand the people who created it a little better.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, I am ready when you are.
So this is the prelude of Fight Magic Items. It's called How I Became a Dragon Master. As a kid in the 90s, I fought goblins and demons. I learned new magic spells and traded in old gear for shiny weapons, raised rebellions, traveled through time, and rode a whale into space. I became the Dragon Master and the Hero of Light. Didn't we all? Besides being a Dragon Master, I was an otherwise average Canadian teen. I'd regularly sequester in a dark bedroom with my friends, drenched in the phosphorus glow of a bulky tube TV, punk rock from the Offspring or NOFX drowning out the game's built-in soundtrack. Mutually entranced by the latest video game. We weren't obsessed with the latest first-person shooter or strategy game. These weren't Warcraft II LAN parties. We weren't playing Doom 2 death matches into the wee hours. We were obsessed with Final Fantasy VI and Xenogears. The creators of these Japanese role-playing games, Japanese RPGs or JRPGs, handed me upgraded armor and sharper swords, pitted me against those goblins and dragons, and deemed me Dragon Master. Like Warcraft II fanatics, I'd haul my game console and my trusty computer monitor, an already ancient at the time Commodore 1702, to a friend's house, where we'd set up our tubes back to back, to avoid spoilers, naturally, and play these single-player games for hours. If you've got kids or a sibling, you're familiar with the term parallel play, where two young children will play within each other's vicinity without necessarily acknowledging each other. Gamers do this too. And those evenings with my friends have become one of my foundational memories. Our homework neglected, the bus rides to school the following morning were filled with in-depth discussions of our experiences with the JRPG of the month. Have you reached that part with Eris yet? Hey, anybody got tips for the Black Dragon? Hey, dude, are you done with Xenogears yet? I really want to borrow it. As creators of some of the most popular video game franchises of all time, in Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, Hironobu Sakaguchi and Yuji Horii are high on the list of visionaries to have left an immeasurable mark on the world. However, JRPGs, like theirs, weren't always popular, and the genre's rise to mega popularity in the mid-90s, as well as their lasting influence on modern games and pop culture, was a long and hard-fought journey. This book is an exploration of how my experience wasn't unique, that the special coming together of Eastern and Western design philosophy, storytelling, history, and pop culture in Japanese RPGs is a shared experience among millions of gamers. Fight Magic Items is the story of how Japanese RPGs brought a genre to the masses and reached meteoric success thanks to some of the most brilliant and bold creators in gaming history. My first exposure to Japanese RPGs was during a visit to my friend's house. While I chased down Krang and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Follow the Foot Clan on my Nintendo Game Boy, he was moving a squat character around a large, multi-screen map on his in a game called Final Fantasy Legend II. I knew Legend of Zelda, so the adventure game concept wasn't strange. And when he let me give it a go, the maps shattered into a double diamond pattern and were replaced with a static sprite of a cartoonish tiger and a menu with two options: fight or run. I was unimpressed. Who wants to be navigating slow-paced menus when I can be slicing and dicing the Foot Clan with every button press? Final Fantasy Legend II, from controversial game designer Akitoshi Kawazu, is not the game I'd use to introduce the genre to anyone, especially a platformer-obsessed kid. It was full of opaque gameplay systems, including a complex monster evolution system that challenged genre newcomers to run before they even knew how to walk. But at the time, Japanese RPGs were still finding their footing in North America, so there wasn't a lot of Japanese RPGs to choose from on handheld devices, especially the ones I had access to. Sure, it was cool, you could take a whole fantasy world on the go, but the moment-to-moment gameplay didn't fire off any endorphins. At least, not yet. It wasn't until a couple of years later, thanks to one of the most revered Japanese RPGs of all time, that I discovered the beauty of Japanese RPGs. And when the genre finally clicked with me, it became an obsession. I was the oldest of three brothers, and we were a lot growing up. My parents did what any tired parents would do: hired the cool babysitter, armed with a cache of video games. We spent most nights playing Doom, but one time he brought something new and not at all like Doom's demon-infested fight for survival. Digitized organ music blared through TV speakers like a harbinger ushering in a logo with purple clouds and lightning. Final Fantasy III. That night, we explored the mines of Narshe, fled the Empire's soldiers, and traveled in a moving castle beneath vast deserts. The bright flash, when we stepped onto a glimmering save spot, filled me with an indescribable sense of safety that I hadn't encountered in video games. The games I'd played before were focused on gameplay and conflict, always keeping the player on their toes with a new challenge leaping onto the screen. But this was a story, a book I could play. I was hooked. From that point forward, I kept tabs on all the Japanese RPGs I could find in the pages of Game Players, Electronic Gaming Monthly, and Nintendo Power. I longed for the releases that never made it out of Japan and lusted over the games I couldn't afford at Toys R Us. And there was one game that stood above them all, convincing me Japanese RPGs were definitively my thing, and every bit as worthwhile as the massive fantasy novels I was contemporaneously falling in love with. That game was Chrono Trigger. I have vivid memories of reading and rereading previews and reviews in gaming magazines. I counted down the days until my birthday, months after its official release, when I knew I'd be able to go with my dad to Toys R Us for a copy of my very own. I can see myself walking back to the car with the game and the shrink wrap, finally mine, and reading the manual cover to cover on the long car ride home by the dim glow of passing streetlights. Where Final Fantasy III caused sparks in the gaming world in the mid-90s, Chrono Trigger fanned those flames into wildfire. At around the same time, I was also discovering J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit and Terry Brooks's The Sword of Shannara, the trading game Magic the Gathering, and Akira Toriyama's legendary anime Dragon Ball Z.
Hmm.
What really caught my attention when I discovered Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI was the way they combined fantasy tropes with science fiction, steampunk, and everything in between in a way that I wasn't finding in books, but that suited my tastes perfectly. To my younger self, Chrono Trigger was a post-apocalyptic science fiction, a gothic vampire hunt, a tried and true medieval fantasy, and an over-the-top shonen anime all at once. From 1995 on, I lived off epic fantasy novels and Japanese RPGs, immersed in these brilliant worlds that seemed so much more complex and exciting than the real life of a high schooler living in a small island community in British Columbia. My teenage years coincided with what many Japanese RPG fans consider the genre's golden age. From the mid-90s emergence of Final Fantasy on the Super NES to the absolute JRPG dominance of Sony's PlayStation into the early 2000s. It was a heady time to be a JRPG fan, with legendary game designers, writers, and artists working at the height of their careers. Without a lot of corporate interference, and at an absolutely dizzying pace. When Final Fantasy XV released in 2016, it had been 7 years since the previous mainline release in the series, Final Fantasy XIII. However, during the 90s, fans expected, and received, new entries in the series on a yearly basis. From 1999 to 2001, Final Fantasy VIII, IX, and X were all released a year apart, and the 7 previous titles were released over the span of a decade. And that was just Final Fantasy. When you started to add all the other high-caliber Japanese RPGs during that period, like Game Art's Grandia, Working Design's Lunar Silver Star Story Complete, and Namco's Tales of Destiny, it was like drinking from a fire hydrant. Despite the rapid pace of releases and my meager wallet, I couldn't get enough. Some teenagers bonded over games of pickup basketball or late-night Dungeons and Dragons sessions. But for my group of friends, it was these Japanese RPGs that glued us together, even as the combined gravity of high school social politics, dating, and the looming threat of adulthood tried to tear us apart. Yeah, dude, I heard you could revive her if you max out all your materia before facing Sephiroth. Hey, did you equip the dragon armor before the battle started? I just got to disc 2. I think I'm almost done. 20 years later, we still regularly connect over online video games to shoot the breeze from our different corners of the country. Like the PC RPGs that inspired them, Japanese RPGs were, and still are, designed to be a predominantly singular experience, but they proved to be so much more than that. Not just for my friend group, but for countless gamers over the years. Our planet is overwhelmingly large, and yet the art we create makes it feel like the most tight-knit of communities sometimes. My friends and I couldn't have been less Japanese if we tried, but something about their cultural approach to video games, along with film and TV, just hit us in the right place at the right time. Before we knew it, fantastical Japanese coming-of-age stories became as foundational to our youth as Tolkien, pickup basketball, and punk rock.
Oh, that takes me back in so many ways, even though like we're separated in age by a decade-ish. It is still like, yeah, this speaks to me and absolutely brings me back to my own middle school and high school years. That said, I know that not everybody who's listening to this show is maybe familiar with some of the just basic terminology, concepts, and tropes behind JRPGs. So you have a little bit of an explainer in your book. Do you want to give us a reading out of that?
Yeah, absolutely. This book is meant for, I tried to write it in an approachable way so people, even if they didn't have like a ton of experience or present experience with Japanese RPGs, could like dive in. But you're right. Some people are coming because they love video games or, they just like books on cultural history. And so I do have an explainer that breaks down how I determine what a JRPG is. I'm a big bucket guy. I like to, I don't like granular, categorization of things and trying to label things as this or not this and not that. And so, I think I have a pretty good breakdown of what a Japanese RPG is. And so I'll read from the book.
Fantastic.
And let you know. So, what is a JRPG? Put simply, a Japanese RPG is a role-playing game from Japan. What separates them from their Western counterparts, and where did their histories diverge? Now that requires a more complex answer. One of the things I find most remarkable about JRPGs, perhaps what I consider their most definable attribute, is how they're born of Western roots, but shaped by Japanese myth, themes, motifs, and storytelling modes that, at the time, couldn't be found in Western media. A relatively new medium, video games are continuously evolving and redefining their boundaries, and doing so at an astonishing pace. Because of video games' fluid nature, it's necessary to explore the video game genres adjacent to JRPGs, adventure games, visual novels, and other games that many fans might not consider JRPGs, but undeniably contain elements that helped shape the genre. All games are in conversation with one another on one level or another. It's impossible to look at modern JRPGs like Final Fantasy XV and not see the influence of open-world Western RPGs like Bethesda's The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. Though all RPGs trace their roots back to Dungeons & Dragons, the way they execute on the RPG concept varies widely. Western RPGs generally hew closer to the tabletop RPG formula with non-linear adventures that emphasize player choice, whereas JRPGs more commonly focus on linear narrative experiences, almost like a novel. This isn't to say that Japanese RPGs are strictly linear, as the genre frequently explores different structures, design ideologies, and experimental approaches to RPGs, but I think it's a decent shorthand to explain the structural divergence between the subgenres. The core gameplay loop for a JRPG goes something like this. A young, plucky hero, sometimes mute, sometimes verbose, almost always naive, leaves their home in pursuit of, or fleeing from, an evil villain. They assemble an eccentric party of fellow adventurers, each filling a role analogous to early Dungeons & Dragons classes as they traipse from town to town, pillaging dungeons and powering up by battling monsters, wild animals, and ne'er-do-wells along the way. They eventually defeat the villain during a climactic final battle and consequently save the world. This is reductive, of course, but it's a popular and reliable framework that has formed the foundation for so many games in the genre from its 8-bit beginnings to today.
Nice. Yeah, that's I don't think if I had spent as long researching and thinking about this book as you have that I could have put that better.
Thanks. I worked on that one a lot. Like that was, like that was important. It's in the intro, and I went through some revisions. And again, like you could get into mechanics, right? But mechanics have diverged so much that like you can't really define JRPGs by specific mechanics anymore. But they are all sort of defined by the same like emotional like narrative elements that come from D&D way back in the day. So it was fun. It was a big challenge writing that, but I'm happy with how it came out.
It's funny that your like introduction to Final Fantasy was on the Game Boy. With my first Final Fantasy game was more in name than anything else. It was Final Fantasy Adventure on the Game Boy.
Not a Final Fantasy game.
Not a Final Fantasy game. In fact, a mana game.
Yeah.
But really good for being on, such a limited system.
Yeah. Much better than Final Fantasy Adventure 2. Yeah. Or at least more accessible and approachable for a, 7-year-old kid.
Yeah. But, I was just thinking like, oh yeah, my first video game that I owned was not a role-playing game. The first game that I owned was Kirby's Dream Land 2 on my bright yellow Game Boy Pocket in 1998, 1999. But the second video game I owned was Pokemon Red.
Yeah.
And, I was stuck from there.
Yeah. I obviously have a big portion of the book in the middle devoted to Pokemon, and in some ways, a big crux at the center of the book is like Final Fantasy VII, sort of pushing Japanese RPGs into the mainstream and helping them become sort of a more cinematic genre that had like appeal outside of just like niche JRPG fans. But I think you can look at Pokemon as being just as influential in the rise of Japanese RPGs as Final Fantasy VII for, I think, different reasons too. Like Final Fantasy VII really changed how we thought about game narratives and the
Mm-hmm.
like narrative presentation in games. Pokemon, on the other hand, I think the mechanics is what
Yeah.
made it so appealing, right? It has very little story. Like the idea of becoming the Pokemon champion is appealing to like kids, but the approachable mechanics and like the cute character designs and just creating like a world that was fun to explore introduced so many gamers to the idea of like, oh hey, it can be fun to
Mm-hmm.
play a game that's just like maps and menus, right?
Yeah.
Like like the original Pokemon games, they're slow. Like I have trouble going back to them now because they're very, very slow. But millions and millions and millions of little kids put up with that because the experience around it was so compelling, and then that taught them how to appreciate different types of games. And I think you can
Mm-hmm.
look at Pokemon as being right up there with Final Fantasy VII as like these are the reasons why you know JRPGs took off in the West narratively and mechanically, kind of around the same
Mm-hmm.
time, in the late '90s, like that.
Yeah, I remember, I think, coming home from, oh, I can't, it was either a store whose name I can't remember, or it was electronics boutique,
Yeah.
with my shrink wrapped Pokemon Red, and like doing the same thing, reading the whole
Mm-hmm.
manual. And one thing that has stuck out to me, it's been what, uh 23, 24 years since Pokemon Red came out in the States.
98, I think.
98, yeah.
Yeah.
One thing that has stuck out to me, that like stuck out to me in that manual, and that like continues to stick with me today, was this little note somewhere in, maybe it was even on the back of the box before I'd broken it open, that just said like, you know, we recommend this game for people with, at least a basic reading level.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, okay, like, at that point I was in fifth or sixth grade. Like
Yeah.
I could read, but I was like, oh, okay, this is a reading game. Like I'd
Mm-hmm.
already sort of known, like, I'd started watching the cartoon,
Yeah.
all that stuff. But it it was very, it feels very akin to your experience of you know this ancient Game Boy Final Fantasy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like it was a new way to experience games, right? And like for me, I am a few years older than you, but not a ton. I was in
Yeah.
grade 12 when Pokemon came out, and my family and I, or I was between grade 11 and 12, I think. My family and I went down to Disneyland, but we decided to drive. So from West Coast British Columbia down to California, and you're in the Bay Area, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so like I remember driving through that area, and it was like I was 16. It was a tough few days, right? Like
Yep.
what 16-year-old enjoys being stuck in a car. But like with their parents. But what did I bring with me? I brought like 7 fantasy novels,
Hmm.
which was ambitious even at the time, right? Like I could get through a Wheel of Time book, pretty quick back then, but I couldn't get through 7 in
Right.
a week long car ride. But I brought a bunch of fantasy novels, and then I brought my Game Boy with Pokemon. And so I remember sitting in the back of my van playing Pokemon till the batteries ran out, and then
Yep.
reading epic fantasy novels, and that kind of coming together of like, I think they were coming together, or kind of coming out at the right time as like this generation of kids who like, I'm among the first generation of people who just grew up with video games, right? Like,
Hmm.
like my mom and dad introduced me to video games. It wasn't something that I had to like convince them of, right? Like
Hmm.
I was playing games on my dad's candy computer and stuff,
Right.
right? My mom, like, I'm pretty sure I got a Game Boy because my mom wanted to play Tetris and Star Trek, right? Like it was my Game Boy, but I think we ended up buying as many games for her as for me. And so like, the timing of these Japanese RPGs, I don't think it's a coincidence that as like the kids who were born in like the early 80s and like grew
Hmm.
up only knowing a world with video games, they were starting to get into like late teenagehood and started to really be into stuff like these more complex, these like morally sort of labyrinthine stories, with a
Hmm.
lot of themes drawn from anime, right? I don't think it's a coincidence that Final Fantasy VII took off when it did, because it had this audience of kids who just like love video games. Video games were just part of life, right? They were a
Yeah.
thing, and they were looking for something that gaming could give them that was more than just, platformers and stuff. The guided experience of the like kind of linear Japanese RPG experience was akin to watching movies and TV shows and
Hmm.
reading books. And so you had these 17, 18-year-olds or 12-year-olds and 20-year-olds who were like, yeah, this is really cool. I can play games, but I can also kind of be immersed in this narrative, like emotionally immersed in this narrative
Yeah.
in a new way. And so it was just a perfect storm of like great timing. Square and Sony, like with his bucket load of cash.
Yeah.
Like the amount of money that they invested in Final Fantasy VII when it came out was like irresponsible. Like there was no guarantee that it was going to sell well in the
Hmm.
States, right? In the West. Like the previous JRPGs sort of capped out in the West at 600,000 units, right? Like, which is okay. But like there, the amount of money, I think it was like $40 million for Final
That's
Fantasy VII, like in the
absurd.
mid '90s, right? Just insane amounts of money, and like there really was no guarantee that they were going to make it back. They were pretty confident about it. They knew it was going to sell really well in Japan, but
Hmm.
like without it breaking out in the West the way it did, it would have maybe kind of crashed and burned a little bit. But then, of course,
Yeah.
it went meteoric and it sold millions and millions of copies. And not only that, but like then it opened the doors to like Xenogears to sell 1 million copies. Like Xenogears is a greatest hits game, and it's like a weird, clunky, super long Japanese RPG about like Carl Jung and like
Yeah.
and, like Gnosticism and like that game, like in what world does a game about Gnosticism and stuff, like that's 70 hours long, sell 1 million units? But Final Fantasy VII did that, right? And so you had all
Yeah.
these games. So not only did they make a bunch of money back on Final Fantasy VII, but like other games that like, previously they might have expected to sell 150,000 copies worldwide, like then went on to sell over 1 million. And so then they were kind of making bank off that. And that really propelled Square forward and set the tone for the PlayStation to become, I mean, what it is today, right? Like,
Yeah.
which is still sort of a market leader.
Yeah.
Um, and it kind of all ties back to that.
I'm also thinking it was just like, they couldn't have known, but it was also like the period of history in which these more narratively complex
Yeah,
games were coming out
yeah,
was just like, we're talking about the end of the Clinton years,
yeah,
the start of the Bush years, 9/11,
yeah,
like, you know, everybody, every young person
hmm,
grew up overnight during that
yeah,
time
yeah, absolutely.
and, are asking for these more narratively complex and like uh more narratively ambiguous
Yeah,
games in a lot of
yeah,
ways. Like I'm
yeah,
thinking about uh my my first exposure to Final Fantasy was one of my classmates in elementary school who, for all of our creative writing assignments, he wrote Final Fantasy fanfic
hmm,
and then transitioned into also writing fanfic about and like building like elaborate connects models about Metal Gear Solid,
hmm,
and like that was like I think the Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII, Metal Gear Solid like set kind of the
yeah.
narrative tone for at least the next decade.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right that it kind of lined up with a lot of Western like politics and kind of cultural conversations, right? Like I remember on September 11th, I had just graduated high school and I ended up back there to meet some friends or something. I was going over there to meet some friends
Mm-hmm.
and I got to the school and all the news was on the radio and stuff. But it's like, like you're consuming that as a young adult. You don't know how to process that. Nobody knew how to process that. But
Yeah.
then I was going home, and that night, I was plunking down in front of the TV and I was playing Suikoden 3 for a few hours, right? And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
you are sort of like seeing like, oh, this world is sort of like, ambiguous and like wrenched by war and wrenched by multiple factions with all sorts of ideals and goals, and you're like, wow, this is kind of like what I'm seeing on the news right now. This is what
For
our world
sure.
is. And like, it's not like the world wasn't like that before, but all of a sudden your eyes are being kind of opened as a young adult to how much more complex and challenging and conflict filled the world is. And these games are reflecting that. And like, I don't, a game like Metal Gear Solid, I don't think I had the tools to like properly understand what it was
Hmm.
tackling at the time. And I keep meaning to go back to replay it actually, because I think it, from a modern perspective, I think, people like Kojima were way ahead of their time, right? Final
Hmm.
Fantasy VII was way ahead of its time. It's like about a group of eco-terrorists who,
Yeah.
like are taking on a capitalist, like planet destroying
Yeah.
company, right? Like, I mean, it's literally like mirrors what's happening right now with like climate change and the fossil fuel industry and how capitalism will cling to that, right?
For
And
sure. Yeah.
we need people like to take on risks themselves to push forward that change. And that's what
Hmm.
like in 1997, that's what Final Fantasy VII was about, right? And then like and then it digs into like individual trauma and how that impacts our abilities to kind of pursue the big changes that we see the world needs. And I don't know, when I was 14, I couldn't understand that stuff. I didn't have the
Yeah.
experience to understand it. But now I replayed Final Fantasy VII while writing this book, and like it's all there. The translation's terrible, but it's
Hmm.
there. The story's there. The themes are there, and I'm like, how was this being written in 1997 and we haven't done anything?
Hmm.
Like 25 years later, how are these themes still so relevant, more relevant than they were? Right? Like random Japanese like game creators in their 30s were
Yeah.
like aware of these things 25 years ago, and yet we're still, we've made good progress in some ways, but
In
not
some ways.
not enough, right? Like,
Yeah.
and they're, I don't know, it's wild just to see like, I think what that unfettered like creativity of like a medium discovering itself kind of produced
Yeah. For sure.
way back when. And that was a lot of fun to dig into in the book and look at how these games were sort of like, they weren't shackled by some of the same fiscal responsibilities that they are now, right?
Hmm.
And that was pretty neat. There's no
Yeah.
blueprint, no financial blueprints, no quarterly investors that they needed to worry about. They could just sort of explore and push, and some of those pioneers did some pretty amazing work in that space. It still holds up so well today, better today
Yeah.
than it did back then in some ways.
So now that we've sort of vaguely made our way back to the book, uh, I did want to ask, are there any parts that just for whatever reason didn't make it into the book that you just really regret? Like, oh, if I could write a second edition, I would definitely put this in.
Oh yeah. So I pitched the book at about 70,000 words.
Hmm.
The final version that's coming out in a month, or coming out, has just come out, or is about to come out, depending on when this episode is released, rings in at 111,000 words. So
Oh
that's
man.
like, yeah, that it's a pretty big book. It's bigger than I expected it to be. The first draft was like 125,000 words. So I cut out a fair bit during revisions,
Hmm.
just to get it down to a more manageable size. It's a better book for it, but it pulls at my heartstrings. And that was after like cutting a bunch of stuff out of the outline that I
Oh
wanted
yeah.
to put in there. I could have written this book and it could have been 200,000 words, and I still would have felt like I was leaving stuff out. But
Hmm.
the purpose of the book wasn't to write about every single video game or Japanese RPG, right? Like that would have been impossible. So I found narrative through lines,
Hmm.
focused on like focused most heavily on the creators of Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest,
Hmm.
but and then watching how those series created new series, or how new games reference back to those. But there were a bunch of chapters, some that I wrote that I really loved, that just didn't kind of fit the narrative and the structure in the end.
Hmm.
I had a big chapter that kind of just dug into like, how do Japanese RPGs tell stories? And so it was a big,
Hmm.
like, and I interviewed a bunch of really great writers to get their take on like, how are these stories told? Why are they different than novels? What can they do that's, can't be done in any other medium. And I wrote it. It was really great. The people I talked to were amazing and had insight that like I felt like I learned a ton.
Mm-hmm.
But in the end, it felt like a side road to the overall story. And so, I wanted to do a big piece on the Sega Saturn. Like it was called The Lost Generation.
Mm-hmm.
And it was all about Sega Saturn Japanese RPGs. Sega Saturn is like an amazing console for Japanese RPGs in Japan.
In Japan, yeah.
But it has very, very little relevance on the success or the shape or the trajectory of the genre in the West, because it flopped in the West. Sega killed it early, and very few of the like, prominent Japanese RPGs actually came out on the system. You got, Panzer Dragoon Saga was one of the big prominent ones. But, we missed out on the best version of Grandia, for instance. It was released in Japan, but never made its way over here. And so, in the end, that would have been a big chapter. I'd love to write it as a feature one day. Like, there's so much story there to tell. But when you're looking at the overall shape of a book and a narrative and the story you're telling, just like writing a novel, if there's, like a side plot that's like really compelling, it's great. But you got to pull it out. You save it for later, and hopefully you find another home for it. And a lot of the book, I wanted to tell an overall story over the course of the book, but I also wanted to make sure like each chapter kind of stood on its own. So if somebody, wanted to dip back into the book and just read about their favorite period or their favorite game, that they were going to get an experience that like they start that chapter and it continues and it concludes, right? It has a full shape. I'm a features writer as a games journalist. So like I write a lot of big long features. And so I kept that in mind while writing this, like the book builds on itself and later chapters reference older chapters and stuff. But I wanted any single chapter in the book to be able to, somebody could pick it up, they could read it, and they'd get that full experience. And so, a lot of these stories and ideas that I had to cut from the book, I hope I'll be able to find that ability to, write them as a feature somewhere in the future. And in fact, that's actually already happened with at least one of the ideas. Like I did a huge, extensive series of interviews about games localization in the 90s and how people like Richard Honeywood and Alex O. Smith came into an industry that didn't like a Japanese kind of like business culture that didn't really care about Western localizations. And so like it was given no resources, there were no tools. Like, they were using VHS tapes. They would record portions of a game on VHS and then watch through that multiple times as they translated into like flat documents, like insanity.
That's
and
wild.
So like I talked to Richard and I talked to Alex, I talked to a few other people and got this amazing look at what games localization was like in the 90s and how somebody like Richard Honeywood said, this has to be better. This can be better. And here's how it's going to happen. And springboarding off Final Fantasy VII success, because it was hugely successful in the West, but it also had like an abhorrent translation, right?
Yeah.
And that wasn't, a reflection on the people who did the work. It was a reflection on the resources they had, the support they had, the tools they had. And Richard knew that could be better. And so it's exploring like, how did we get from Final Fantasy VII, which is like borderline unreadable sometimes at the beginning of the PlayStation, to Vagrant Story at the end of the PlayStation, which is like sublime. It's one of the best localizations of all time. And it happened in one console generation. Like think about like the difference between a game at the beginning of the PlayStation 4's lifespan and a game at the end. Like there's not that big of a gap. And that was one of the longest generation cycles, right? But like going from Final Fantasy VII to Vagrant Story in like 5 years, incredible. And so that was a story that just, it was too big and it just didn't fit the structure of the book. And I saw that as an opportunity to be like, okay, but I can tell this story and I can take this and I can put this out there and it can be a companion to the book. And so that's coming out hopefully in the next couple of weeks, or has already come out. By the time the book is out, it should be available, and so that'll be a great companion.
Fantastic.
And some of those interviews helped inform chapters about Vagrant Story and Final Fantasy VII and like those games, and I was able to use that in the book. So like it's there, it's in the book, but there's so much more. It's such an incredible big story. And I'm really happy to have gotten to work on it. It's one of my favorite things I've ever kind of worked on, and it was really rewarding to get to use this book as an opportunity to explore all sorts of stories.
That's fantastic. Well, I think we've already touched on a number of favorite things that you've had in this
Mm.
book. Uh, what I would like to touch on, though, is is there anything that you've been uh, reading, playing, listening to, watching, otherwise consuming in the media landscape, whether new or old, recently that you're just really excited to get other people on the train with you?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I've been reading recently, and I'm just about to finish, is a novel called Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin, and
Ooh.
it's sort of a coming of age novel that kind of falls back. It's like a tragic romantic comedy, I
Hmm.
guess, but it's more like it's about like love and friendship when like romance isn't the answer. But it's also like,
Oh.
and I specifically bring it up because it's also about two creative people who meet and bond over video games as children and then grow up and make games together, and
Mm.
watching how their relationship, like as creatives and business partners, impacts their, their friendship and their love for each other, and their like, the way they grow up together, and their paths
Hmm.
come together and they diverge, and there's heartbreak and there's sorrow and there's joy, and it's all kind of wrapped around video games, creating video games, and the idea of like what games can bring to people's lives and to culture that no other medium can do. And I can be pretty like bearish on the idea of like video game culture in like in fiction stories.
Hmm.
I find that it can be hit or miss. Often it just feels like window dressing, like to kind of give this,
Hmm.
oh, like this, look at this, this is a nerdy book. But like this book is just you couldn't take the video games out of it. It's like gaming and games culture, like creating games, the industry, the love of games, fandom. It's like it's part of everything. It's part of the character and plot and
Hmm.
theme and structure, and like it couldn't exist otherwise. And the author, like, very obviously has like a tremendously personal relationship with games, and I've never read anything like it. It's impossible, like, for me to think of a book that's more in my wheelhouse
Hmm.
than this, right? Like it's about friendship and love and video games, and that's just amazing. And it references a
That
bunch
sounds
of like
awesome.
random great Japanese RPGs as well, which is just like I like, and it's like, be marketed as a mainstream novel, and it's got Chrono Trigger and Suikoden
Hmm.
references, and I'm like, this is, how does this exist? Like, this is incredible. And so that's Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin, and it's incredible. And so that one, when I'm not reading about it, or when I'm not reading it, I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about
Hmm.
it right now. I've got about 30 pages left, and it's absolutely one of my favorite novels of the year.
That
Um,
sounds fantastic.
yeah, and then I read a ton of books. I also want to shout out maybe a few of the books that I read
Yeah.
while writing Fight Magic Items or before, because like it was influenced a lot by a lot of like games journalists that I admire.
Hmm.
Chris Kohler, he's not a games journalist anymore. He's kind of moved over into to Digital Eclipse, where he just put out the Cowabunga collection, like a
Oh yeah,
collection of
yeah.
Ninja Turtle games, and so he was heavily involved in that. He used to be a games journalist, and he's written a few books. Power Up was one of his first, and it was
Mm.
about like sort of the history of video games.
Hmm.
It's a number of years old now, so it like it's not completely up to date, but about 5 or 6 years ago, he did a revised version with a new chapter and stuff, and it's very good. But more specifically, his book on Final Fantasy V
Mm.
from Boss Fight Books really showed me how you can blend your personal experience and that emotional like play that you have as a
Hmm.
child and a teenager and as an adult, and build it into like this idea of like a history and telling the stories of people and video games. That game history books don't have to just be like, recitals, like
Hmm.
textbook style recitals of like historical facts and data, that they can be about people. And so that was his book Final Fantasy V from Boss Fight Books. Jason Schreier's books Press Reset and Blood,
Oh
Sweat, and
yeah.
Pixels are also incredible. He had a really like, he kind of digs into kind of themes through the book, and then speaks to a lot of developers, and I really like that, again, bringing people to the forefront. uh
Hmm.
the book that maybe inspired me the most through this process was Matt Alt's Pure Invention.
Oh,
And
uh-huh.
it's kind of like along the similar lines as Fight Magic Items, but it's more generally focused on how Japanese pop culture made its journey to the West,
Mm-hmm.
and then kind of became this force around the same time that Japanese RPGs did. Imagine that! Like, what a
Uh-huh.
coincidence. Um, and funny enough, like I actually discovered this book like as we were kind of dealing with like an acceptance. Like I came up with the idea for Fight Magic Items,
Mm-hmm.
and then my agent had pitched it out, and it was looking like it was going to land at Running Press, and then at the same time, this book Pure Invention came out, and I was holy smokes, this is this is like right in the wheelhouse of what I'm working on. And then I read it, and it's just an incredible look at Japanese pop culture over like from the post-war era
Mm-hmm.
to the modern day. And Matt's actually, his background is in games localization, and so he worked on a bunch of like the Japanese RPGs that I cover in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't even really know that at the time. There was just sort of this confluence. So he has a really
That's
wonderful like
perfect.
opening to the book that looks at Final Fantasy VII specifically, and then he discusses Japanese RPGs and also like how they overlap with anime and Dragon Ball and Sailor Moon and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a joy to read, and his level of understanding and experience with the subject matter, his depth of research, and the way again like he reaches out and finds people and tells stories through the experiences people have. That was really like profoundly inspiring to me as I was working on my own book. And so it's called Pure Invention: How Japan Made the Modern World. I
That
believe
sounds
that's a
right.
subtitle.
It'll be in the show notes.
It had a subtitle change between editions, so I can't remember where they landed after the version that I read. But it's incredible, and it's about the same length as my book, so similar shapes, similar lengths, and I highly recommend that. Anytime somebody asks me about this book, I try to bring up Pure Invention, because
Fantastic.
Matt's amazing, and his book is incredible. So.
Well, listeners, links to all of those things will be in the show notes so that you don't have to memorize all of this, listen to it 8 times, and write it down piece by piece as if you're localizing a game in the 90s. Although, if you do want to listen to this episode 8 or 9 times in a row, boost those download numbers, I won't argue.
Mm-hmm. Give it a 5-star rating on every
Absolutely.
platform. Yeah, every time you download it.
Uh, Aiden, thank you so much for coming on the show. Before we get going, where can our listeners find you elsewhere?
Yeah, I really again appreciate being on the show. It's such a thrill finally getting to chat with you like this. I'm all over the place online. The best places are, you can find me on Twitter at a Dribble of Ink, ADRIBBLEOFINK, a Dribble of Ink, like my old blog. It's funny, I feel like at this point more people know me from other work than my
Mm-hmm.
blog. So it's always funny to me to kind of reference back to a Dribble of Ink, but it was a huge part of what like my journey to get to this book. It's where I
Yeah.
first started writing about games, and I'm still on Twitter at a Dribble of Ink. I tweet a lot. You'll find a lot of content about Japanese RPGs, and the book coming up, you'll find a lot of content about old tube TVs, because
Mm-hmm.
that's a thing I'm into nowadays. I also have a website, which you can find by Googling my name. But if you're interested in the book, there's a one-stop shop for Fight Magic Items that I created just at fightmagicitems.rocks. So Fight Magic Items rocks.
Nice.
So yeah, Fight Magic Items, the title of the book, .rocks. And that's a big one-page website that has all the information you could need about the book. It tells you about the book. It has excerpts. It has links to places where the book's been featured. It has a preview, so you can dip your toes into the text if you want to, you want more than the prelude that I just read. And a whole bunch of stuff, pre-order links, everything you could possibly need, all in one fancy, easy to read website. And that's
Excellent.
probably the best place.
And can you tell our listeners very quickly about Astrolabe?
Oh yeah, I also run a newsletter. That's right. So I have a newsletter called Astrolabe. You can find it at astrolabe.aidanmoher.com. That link will be in the show notes as well. It's an issue-based newsletter about geek culture. Every issue has like a feature essay.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that's written by me. Sometimes I bring in like guest writers. Sometimes what I'll do, again, I like to talk to people. So a lot of issues will have just like an interview style feature where I'll connect with somebody about a specific topic. So I connected with Patrick Klepek, who is a games writer, about the challenges of being a young writer and growing up visibly online. He was a teenager when he started writing for like oneup.com, right? He's an adult now, he's got kids, but he's been around, like, he's my age, but he's been around for like forever. And so we talked about like how hard was it to be a young person growing up visibly the way that you have. I talked to the lead singer of Less Than Jake about being creative and sustaining creative projects during the pandemic, right? Like, how do you do that? Like, they tour relentlessly, right? Like, to get a band together to create an album, like, usually you get into a room and you jam together. How do you do that when you can't, right? And so we chatted about that. Like, what does it mean to be a creative person during the pandemic? And so, I reach out and I talk to lots of people, and I just released the 25th issue of Astrolabe. So it's got those features. Every issue, I also delve into an old retro video game. In Late to the Party is the name of that column. And so I'll often go on Twitter. I'll put out a poll. My audience will pick a game. I spend an hour with it, and then I write about it. What is it good? Is it interesting? How does it hold up? And that's always fun. And then I, recommend a book each issue as well, and have links to, work that I've put out recently. So it's good. It's a whole grab bag of everything. It tries to be, it's not just about video games. It's not just about books or science fiction. It's like geek pop culture across the spectrum.
I highly recommend it.
It's been really fun. My old, my background is in blogging. I used to have to hop on the computer at a minute's notice to break news and try to get out 5 posts a week. And that I couldn't do that anymore, with full-time work and writing books and having kids and a family and all that. So the newsletter has really kind of worked out well. It gives me time to get those thoughts out and really come at people with perspectives that I've been thinking a lot about, and I really enjoy it. So that's Astrolabe, astrolabe.aidanmoher.com. It's free.
Yeah, it's free. It's worth it at twice the price.
I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Well, Aidan, once again, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's a dream come true since the very first season.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm so glad that we did this. I hope that, for the next book, I'll be able to do it again. Because I
absolutely will.
Love chatting with you. I feel like I knew you when you were playing Final Fantasy Adventure on your Game Boy. Like, that's how long we've known each other. So I'm hoping that this isn't the last time I'm able to come in and talk to you guys.
I, as the owner of this podcast, I can guarantee, as long as this podcast is around, that it will not be.
Excellent. Love it.
Tales from the Trunk is mixed and produced in beautiful Oakland, California. Our theme music is Paper Wings by Lillian Boyd. You can support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/trunkcast. All patrons of the show now get a sticker and logo button, along with show outtakes and other content that can't be found anywhere else. You can find the show on Twitter at Trunkcast, and I tweet at HBBisniaks. If you like the show, consider taking a moment to rate and review us on your preferred podcast platform. And remember, don't self-reject.